Wow. Well, thank you, Felice, and thank you, Susie. This has been such an amazing journey, and I'm just so humbled that we got a chance to do this together.
Me too. Well, I thank you because, anyway.
We're too close together?
Oh, is that what it is?
I don't know. We're starting to create energy.
Malfunction. Okay.
So I told Susie all I have to do is wind her up and let her go, and it'll be more of my prompting than a real conversation, unless there are possibly things that we can maybe do a little exchange about. But so I knew immediately when this project came that I wanted to work with Susie, and we had just missed each other when I arrived in Houston in 2000. Susie had just left, and there was so much about the work that I knew and so much about the work that I didn't know. And so I felt this was an opportunity for us to really present a sort of full picture. And this exhibition functions more or less as a mini retrospective, I should say. So we start with the earliest work, which Susie started as sculpture, and then I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so this is from a body of work that I worked on from the mid-'80s to the late '80s, and it's aluminum foil. I mean, I don't know if you remember the old kinds of gum, sticks of gum that had that little piece of wax paper around it and the aluminum foil. I used to like peel that aluminum foil off and roll it into a roll. Just one of those habits. And then one day I was just sitting in my studio and I started playing with some aluminum foil, and I decided to make essentially a rug. So the first one was just a long strip. It kind of looked like a shag rug, aluminum tail or something. One of them is about 44 inches square, and it's just a very deep shag rug. And then this one, which is a grid. And this is really the beginning of where I started. With the grid, you've got this thing, this interval between similar elements. So that's what makes a grid. And so for me, when you're doing two-dimensional or even three-dimensional work, that notion of interval and space can kind of equate to time, because otherwise you can't work time into a static work of art. And time is such an important thing for us as human beings. I mean, we take it for granted, our notions of time or how we experience time. And yet I think it's something that we just take for granted, don't really think about. Anyway, in any case, so this is a piece of sculpture, and in some ways it works with some of the, the play of light and shadow, which, like traditional sculpture does, but also, unlike a piece of most sculpture, it's clinging to the wall like a painting. And I liked it that it kind of was straddling, in that sense, those two worlds. And the grid it's fairly defined in some areas, and then just falls apart up there towards the top.
But there is a wonderful early sculpture, and Susie started formally trained in sculpture, but there's a wonderful piece of traditional sculpture that's also in.
So that's actually comes from, I used to kind of haunt the Egyptian rooms at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I just loved the way they would wrap mummies, because that's such an irregular shape of an object, and yet the wrapping would be so regular and perfect. And those people must have developed that skill over generations and passed it on, because when you think about trying to make that regular shape with strips of fabric, it's just kind of mind-boggling. And so that's a box, and inside the box is a sort of a ritualized object, utterly worthless to anybody else but me, and it's embedded in that box. And so again, that's where math plays in, because figuring out, I knew how many layers deep I wanted the fabric. And by the way, it was muslin as opposed to linen like the Egyptians would use. I would tear it into these thin strips and then sew it into a bias tape type thing, if you guys know what bias tape is, used in sewing. And it took me like a year to do that piece, because I would mix glue and water, lay the fabric over it. I could only work on like 4, right? I could only do like 4 at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4, on 3 sides, and I'd have to let it dry overnight and then go, turn it over and do the next 3 sides. But but it took me quite a while to figure out. I knew how wide I wanted the strips of fabric to be, and I knew how deep I wanted it to be, but figuring out and how far, how much of a lip I wanted. Anyway, it just took a while. So it's a very meditative type process to figure out that kind of thing. So, so these.
Should we start with the drawings?
Yeah, let's start with the drawings.
I think people would be very interested in knowing, how did you get from working in the three-dimensional into the two-dimensional and going from sculpture to works on paper?
Okay, so I don't know how many of you have made sculpture, but there's always material issues with sculpture. And back then, stores, they closed at 6 o'clock at night. They weren't open on Sundays. If you ran out of something, you were just, on a Friday or Saturday night, you were out of luck for the whole weekend. It just stunk. And then I went to New York, and not only and they closed really early. Some of them weren't even open on Saturday, and I didn't have a car. And it just, making sculpture just became, it was just too much of a bother. Oh, not to mention which, one night when I was still in Houston, I was screwing something together at 3 o'clock in the morning. At that point, I had waist-length hair, and I was in an awkward position, and the next thing I know, the drill bit is smack up against my ear, and my hair is like wrapped around the drill bit. And it's like,
You went with a pixie after that, right?
Yeah, well, that doesn't. But that doesn't happen when you're making drawings or paintings. You might get some paint on you, but you don't have a drill stuck to your ear. Anyway, so these actually grew out of a number game that I used to play from the time I was about 13 years old, and it's just a really simple number game. I'm not going to go into it. Trust me, it's really simple. But I realized that the numbers also. The way I would add the numbers up, it was like making these little diagrams, and that there was like visual potential in these diagrams. And so for a long time, that was my graduate school work, was doing these drawings. So I've been doing these drawings since about 1979, and they were on paper for a long time. I wanted to make paintings, but it took a long time to figure it out. So anyway, these three works. This early one is from 1988. These, I think, are from, so this is one way the number system, I could get it onto paper. In this, the numbers actually, it would go like 1, 7, 3, 1. It would make a triangle. And so every shape on here is reflecting that, whereas they're open-ended. They're not necessarily connecting up. Something like this is a line because this is going 1, 7, 4, 1. Just trust me on that. I mean, that's what it does.
But just to, because I think it's worth noting, we'll give them the lay of the land, and then they can go home and experiment. Okay. If you've ever seen a touch tone phone or a calculator, you'll know it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? Right. So and I was just talking to a young group, and I was saying, no matter what sequence that you calculate all those numbers, the sum is always the same. And so bringing visibility of the grid into that is really what is the interplay here. It's a numbers game, but it's also a visualization of that numbers game, which is either contiguous or overlapping. Right. So I say all that to say we do have the ephemeral work in a small case against the wall in the back. But Susie has been really extraordinary in taking something which is very esoteric, which is numbers and geometry, and visualizing them in a very esoteric and fragmentized way. So it's a beautiful interplay, and I didn't want that to slide.
Yeah, except that we are inherently mathematical beings. Right. I mean, just the fact that you can sit down in a chair, walk under a doorway that might, you might have to sit down, or a batter can hit a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. Those are just incredible mathematical calculations that we make without even thinking of it or being aware of it. And so, we just do it automatically. So in any case, this is where the pattern is laid out contiguous, and that means, so each set of numbers is drawn out first on a square, then on a triangle, then on a circle, and there is a substructure for that in there with a drawing partially laid over it. So I would do a full, so this is the idea that I woke up with one morning after years of trying to figure out how to get these onto canvas, because you can't really draw onto the raw canvas. I mean, canvas changes shape. Trying to lay out a grid, I mean, it would just be such a mess. It would be pointless to try to paint over it and then tape over it. So these are done with tape. This canvas started off white. I taped where I wanted the lines to be, painted black, and pulled the tape off. But before I did that, I did a full-scale drawing, glued it to the back of the canvas, shone a light through it so I could see where my lines were, and then taped where the tape was going to go, paint it black, pull it off. So this is a contiguous. That means that the square is next to the triangle, is next to the circle, and it results in these hieroglyphic type marks. On this one, that one is from a little bit later. I think this is from 1970. I'm sorry, 1990. So this is one of the first ones that I did where I figured out that you have to seal the tape. If you don't seal the tape, you get a lot of seepage under it and you just have a mess. Although some people can use that mess to great effect. One of them is standing right here. But yeah, you have to, anyway, you have to seal. This is called number 7. And it's actually one of the patterns, one of the numbers pages that I worked with. There's a page of numbers for each painting. This is one of the pages that I worked with the most. It was always my go-to when I was going to try something new. And it's 1471.
And the titles are basically based on the page numbers.
Well, yeah, part of the title. Yeah, they're just numerical. I mean, painting number 7 and then 1471. So that's how they're titled. So this is one, and then this one I used to think of as pickup sticks because it's 3 colors, and yeah, I just kind of decided at random what colors were going to be yellow, which ones were going to be blue. So at one point this canvas was all yellow, and I taped where I wanted the yellow lines to be. Then it was all red. I taped where I wanted the red lines to be, and then it was blue. Taped that, painted it black, pulled all the tape off. And so this is also from 1990, red and black. This one is called Hypercube, and Hypercube it's also called a tesseract. It's like it's called in the nth dimension. It's sort of a 4-dimension. It's sort of in the 4th dimension. So it's a fairly you'll see it on the substructure over there. But this is all of my number pages, which is a fairly thick notebook, compressed into one painting. So each one of these lines actually is a stand-in for sometimes as many as 1,200 lines. Not that I drew it 1,200 times. I knew it was there and I didn't draw it. So anyway, so that's like the culmination of all of my line work.
And we
one small painting.
Well, we call this the lost decade too, and I think it was because for me, and very personally, it was a part of the work that I never knew. I knew of a lot of the more optical illusionistic work, but I didn't know of this early work. And so as we began to talk and visit with each other, I would go to Susie's home studio, this started coming out. And I was like, well, have these been seen? When's the last time they've been seen? I mean, it's such an important part of the evolution of your work that we really wanted to bring this decade back to the fore, so.
Yeah. So, yeah, and also, I mean, I think that the minimalist underpinnings of the work really shows through here. Yeah. Okay, and then here's the yellow one. I think this is a one-off. I don't think I ever did another one like it, unfortunately, because it's actually kind of a nice painting. So anyway, I was in a show with some other, at that time, emerging Texas artists like Aaron Perzett and Jeff Elrod and some other people like that, and they were all doing these very colorful, big, just gorgeous paintings. And I mean, my work was fine, but it just lacked the wall power of this color and this just fabulous color. I'm going, I have to do something about that. So I was working in my studio, and I used to like to have the TV on, and they were replacing the cable lines or something, and I just kept ending up with this static on the TV screen, and I started looking at it one day and I realized, God, this actually has some visual possibilities, and I just was feeling a need to move on and do something else in addition to having seen that, been so like, my work just needed something. Anyway, so I started bringing other elements into it. And this is where the idea of interval starts to really become important. So on top of interval and space, I'm starting to add in, oops, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say there, never mind. So this is kind of the same, it's the same process, essentially, same taping process. But what's going on here is there's 3 colors, black, gray, and white, and it's the same pattern, but what's altering is the order of the color. So in this one, which is the darker one, the first element is black, the second is gray, the third is white. In the next one down, it's black, white, gray, then gray, black, white, black, white, black, gray, white, gray, black. And so that's why there's this subtle change in the coloration. And I always intended to do bigger versions because they really need to be big enough to fill the visual field, because they really sizzle on your eye when you're standing at the right distance from them. They just really pop and sizzle.
I was just thinking too of this parameters that you set as you're, especially in the early practice, that you would set a parameter of only working in a very limited palette and with very specific kind of notations. And it's kind of back to the numbers game in a strange way.
But also, I mean, because I'd come out of sculpture and not drawing and painting, I felt like I didn't know anything about color. You know, I needed to teach myself about color because I was long out of school at that point, and you know, I'd had to take some color classes and just anyway. Now I can understand the value of them, but back then, you know, not. So, but it's funny how much you can actually learn about color from working with black, gray, and white, because I wasn't working with any of these colors straight out of the tube. I was, you know, mixing. You know, the black is really, you know, brown and blue, and this gray is not black and white, it's black, brown, and, I'm sorry, brown, blue, and white. There's actually two different shades of gray. You know, each painting has 2 different shades of gray, a couple of different shades of white. There's actually a lot of very subtle layering in there. So once I started doing these, I just started doing a lot of other things as well. So then I started doing these. The pattern paintings are also at the same time as these. Pattern painting number 1 down there at the far end, and then pattern painting number 3. This one is actually much later on the far end. That's called a spectrum painting. It's a slightly different pattern. So these actually span from mid-90s to, what's the date on this one, 2013 or something. So this, I think, is 95. So the line work I pretty much quit doing in 95. And went on to these. So.
And you're teaching yourself color.
Yeah, I was learning color. Actually, mixing color was such a blast. Anyway, actually this painting, this bigger painting, is printed. It's not painted. So, yeah.
We thought we'd trick people. And we'll get into the later work, which is, but coming up with this, the compositions themselves, because you are now, what are the inspirations for the pattern painting? We know that you're starting to delve into color and teaching yourself color, and then perception and how.
I was just experimenting with what I could do with tape, because layering paint and tape, I mean, I just had no idea what possibilities were in there, or what I could do with it. And how much paint I could actually load on top of a layer of tape, before there was no way to pull the tape off. Because most of these were done with it's a Tarte Pak crepe tape. And it's a paper tape, so there's a real limit to how much paint you can get on it before it's just glued to the canvas. This has something like 30 layers of paint on it, so you could still, you can see it. If you get up close to it, you can feel it. This is the last element.
Don't touch it. Only Susie can do that.
The very last element, you can see how much it's raised off of the canvas, and it's because it's got about 30 coats of paint on it.
So it becomes very sculptural. I mean, in a way.
Kind of, yeah. But anyway. So the very last one, actually, I had never seen the Ellsworth Kelly spectrum paintings, and finally the Museum of Modern Art put them up, and they are just absolutely glorious. They're long, each one is a single color, and they're just these long, relatively, they're about this wide, I don't know, maybe a little bit narrower. They're very tall, and they're just, one color after another, and they're absolutely glorious. And I was really taken with them, and so that's sort of the inspiration for this spectrum-based works. So
should we go to the ginghams?
Wanna go around?
Then?
Yeah, let's go to the ginghams.
Yeah.
So part of the, what I was exploring at the time I started doing these static paintings, I started trying to simplify and just see what the possibilities were with working with tape and paint. And so one day I just went as simple as I could, and that resulted in this. And it's really, they're really visually active paintings. They're very interested in the nature of perception, how we see, how we experience what we see. And so, op art, I think, is very much about that. And this really works as that. The other thing is where you stand in relation to the work affects how you're going to experience it. So that can differ for everybody, but you can get up really close to it, you can stand a little bit further back. At some point, these patterns will start to change and emerge. It'll start throwing off other colors, yeah.
Well, they're anything but static. They're extremely dynamic, and yet the grid is a constant in all of it.
And so this is what happens when you take a gingham painting and you alter this shape, you alter this width of the tape. So it's the same pattern as this, but I'm using different widths of tape, and this is again where the whole idea of interval and space comes in, the interval between similar elements. As the tape gets wider and the placing of the tape gets further apart, you start to get an even wilder kind of optical effect going on.
And light seems to has always been there, but it really becomes a participant in these paintings in a different way, and especially when we started looking at Blue X and Galaxy.
So I started to think, okay, so what would happen if I took the same pattern, but instead of using the similar colors? So the way I would do these is that this painting started off white, and then I would draw a line at regular intervals and put a piece of tape across it to preserve what became this white square, paint the whole thing blue, and then pull the tape off. So what was left was blue with a white stripe in between. I then taped in this direction, and that was preserving white, a little bit of blue and some white all the way across. Painted the whole thing blue again, ran the tape the other direction. So now there's a grid of tape covering the entire painting. Painted the thing this dark navy blue that actually looks black, but it's a dark navy blue, and pulled all the tape off, and that's what's left. And I thought it'd be interesting to use the same process, but start changing the value of the paint in between. And so I would mix 10 shades, in this case, of blue, from the darkest blue to white. And so it's usually, except that that's on the diagonal, of course. So it's the same process, just with different values mixed in there, and that's the same process, but with other colors.
But this dynamic is very different. It's almost as if it's defying, in the way that these are very active, these ginghams are very active. This almost feels as if it's defying the two-dimensional frame, like it's either lifting up from its corners,
right?
And that. So I want my prompt was really to talk about the role of light and bringing light and diffused light into it. I mean, the colors are certainly.
Right. Well, at some point, I was living in New York when I started doing these, and very close to the East River, and that has the same light effects as the Hudson River Valley. So you've got a lot of moisture in the air, and light is very diffused and it's just so rich. And I lived in this building that had this rooftop, so we were like a block from the East River. And we could go up and get out on the roof and watch the sunset and sometimes the sunrise, and it was just so amazing to watch those colors with the Manhattan skyline, right in front. Sunset was really something. And I really wanted to work that atmosphere, that feeling of atmosphere. I wanted that in my colors. And so that's how paintings like that came to be. But again with that, that's actually just red, yellow, and blue. It's your eye that's mixing the greens and the violets. So that's yet another aspect of op art, that you can, fool the eye or make the eye see a color that really isn't there, much like in this work. So, yeah.
So,
and then this is the vitrine.
Yeah,
and
the studies.
So, yeah, what's in here? So this is down here, this one, where the drawing is different colors. That's the substructure that I would use. So this is a preparatory drawing. This is not the same one for Hypercube, but it's a preliminary for Hypercube.
These are for the very early ones.
Yeah, this is for the line paintings. So this is the substructure for Hypercube, and you can actually see what a Hypercube looks like under there. And then this is offset a little so you can see how it would match up. But this is a Hypercube type drawing. Those are 2 number pages that I would use to make the drawings. Beyond that are a couple of more substructures, 3 more substructures. And then all of these are these are
Studies.
Just kind of explorations, some of which I followed through on and some of which I didn't. That's a color test. Every time I mix a new batch of color, I have to test it, right? I mean, you never know what it's going to look like in a painting until you actually get it on a painting. So I generally do small tests that are actually kind of nice all by themselves. That's a pattern test, as are these others. This one is kind of a one-off. That's actually like lava lamp shapes behind there, under that grid. So
do you want to talk about the newest body of work? These
Yeah.
larger paintings are.
Yeah, these are actually these are printed, and they're more recent works. And actually, Paul Kramer standing here is the man who helps me.
Hi, Paul.
He's the one that knows the programs. But some of these are actually built in the computer, so they're vector art. That means they're built entirely in the computer, color, shape, everything. But it does do the same thing that these others, like the way that painting there pushes at the side. It doesn't even look like a straight edge there, it's wobbling. And this thing does the same thing. This white edge here just really like pulls the whole painting, that light area in the center. I mean, down there. Anyway, it's been really fun and interesting to do these, to work
Someone
these.
brought up the question about labor, that you go from this laborious.
Right, but this is every bit as much work. It's just different work. It's just totally different work. Yeah, I mean, I love painting. I mean, it's like, every time I sit down to do a painting, I want to make a better painting than the last one I made. And but this is just a whole different way of working, and it's just as satisfying, and it's got a lot of potential. So.
And
Anyway.
of course, sculpture is never too far because you're.
No, back to this. Oh yeah, this one is a little bit different because this was we scanned in a painting and then started playing with it in the computer, and so that was an existing painting, and it just made those kind of, yellow submarine shapes or Teletubbies or something. So then there's these 2 sculptures. So this is White Cube, and it's a white cube. It's got, well, it's just a very basic statement. I felt like it was important. I mean, we always start with a blank canvas or a blank piece of paper or, blank something. And so it just seemed like an important thing to do. And then this one is a maquette. It's a study that comes off of this painting, which I think is about as minimal as a piece of op art can get and still function as an op art painting.
Well, what I love about the cube, the reason why I chuckled, is because that even though it's white, the interplay of shadows on this piece is almost as if it's an interplay of ghost, which is sort of this gradations of gray and white. And I think it absorbs everything around it and it's sort of projecting it out. So it's almost striking to find that it is white, because the only thing that's lit is here, and depending on where you stand with it, it literally can go from white to gray, or absorb the colors kind of around it. So I think it's kind of interesting to
there's more than one gray, because the light hits every side differently.
Exactly.
So, yeah, and it's kind of, some of the grays are kind of the same color as the grays on that little cube. So yeah, they play off together nicely. And yeah.